Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday, day 2, virtual learning. Pull up the Jeopardy question. There you go. Name that element, number 1. So let's go ahead. We'll get started here. So a little review of yesterday's FRQ, which was also your attendance check. So I thought overall we did pretty well with that. The behavioral theory, pretty straightforward there. Anything that was related to operant conditioning. And then, a lot of you talked about your parents use some sort of extrinsic motivator to get you to do something around the house. Some of you talked about studying to get good grades or doing the virtual learning to get good grades. So those were all good examples of behavioral motivation. Drive reduction, like most of you talked about eating or being thirsty. Optimal arousal, some interesting ones there, especially with the fact that you might be kind of isolated in your home. So coming up with some creative ways there to increase your level of arousal. And then maybe also some of you talked about being a little stressed out. So things that brought that stress level back down. And then humanistic theory, hierarchy of needs. The one thing, some people lost not a couple of points, but a point or two here if you didn't identify the specific level of the hierarchy in terms of what that behavior related to. So some examples that were pretty good, talking about physiological needs. Obviously, eating would be a physiological need. Some of you talked about you did that before you started your virtual learning lesson. You ate food, so you met that physiological need. Some of you talked about sleep as well, which was a good one. And then safety needs, that was one that people talked about as well, especially relating to the what's going on with the coronavirus, having to stay inside, not go out and hang out with your friends, isolating yourself. Those were all good examples of behaviors motivated to meet those safety needs. And then love and belonging. No one really talked too much about that, probably because if you are isolated right now, you're probably not able to do too much with that. And then esteem, a lot of you talked about still putting in good effort into virtual learning, maintaining your workout schedule if you have sports coming up or anything like that. So the biggest thing there with Maslow's hierarchy of needs is those behaviors meet a specific need. So obviously, if you have any questions about the theories of motivation, email me and we'll figure that out. So look in today's question. So yesterday I talked about the theories of motivation. Today talking about the theories of emotions. So we're going to talk about the 3 major theories of emotions, and then your attendance check is pretty similar to what you did yesterday. You're essentially going to describe a time that you felt a very strong emotion and then apply all 3 of the theories to that emotion and how that theory would explain that emotion. So emotion is often defined as a complex state of feeling that results in physical and psychological changes that influence thought and behavior. And then once again, go back to the nature-nurture spectrum here. We're going to have some nature as well as some nurture here, looking at the theories of emotions. So what I want you to think about here is think of a time you were really angry and what happened in your body, right? So you're really angry. Think about what happened in your body in terms of what kind of physiological response did you have? And then think about a time you were really excited and what happened in your body. So what was a physiological reaction to being excited? And the reason I bring this up is because those are 2 different emotions, but the way your body responds was probably pretty similar. Now, your facial expression may have been a little different. You can see the images here, the 2 children. However, what actually happens inside your body was probably pretty similar, and that's going to connect to one of the theories we talked about. So as we talked about emotion, it's a complex state of feeling that results in physical and psychological changes that influence thought and behavior. And one thing we'll talk about here before we get into the theories of emotion is there's 6 universal emotions. You have sadness, happiness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. So those are your 6 universal emotions. So if we look over here, we have 6 universal emotions. The reason we call them universal is because we see them in all cultures throughout the world. So that tells us, because we see these all throughout the world, that it's not something that you learn through your environment, or you don't learn it through the culture you're raised in. Right? All cultures have these 6 universal emotions, which means they must be hardwired in us as humans. So you have happiness, you have sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. And then you'll learn a little bit more in the focus notes on kind of how we learned about these universal emotions and how facial expression is also universal as well. So when we look at the theories of emotions here, there's going to be 3 different components, 3 different aspects that make up an emotion. So we'll just kind of define the 3 components here, and then the theories all take the components and put them in a different order. So the first one we'll talk about here, and this was what the question that I asked you about, what happened when you felt anger versus excitement, is physiological arousal. And once again, when we're talking about arousal, we're talking about alertness, attentiveness, being aware. So physiological arousal is when your body responds or is more attentive, more aware. So specific physiological arousal responses would be sweaty palms, heart racing, dilated pupils. And once again, a lot of that goes back to what we've talked about with the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is going to speed up your nervous system. So it's going to increase your heart rate, your breathing rate. You're going to perspire more. And then the parasympathetic, or we talked about parachute, slows you down. Parasympathetic, that's going to do the opposite. Then it slows down your nervous system. And that's what we call the rest and digest. So physiological arousal, that is going to be how your body responds. And that's going to be one part of what makes up an emotion. Second part is the conscious experience, and this is the cognitive labeling of an emotion. So when you feel an emotion, you're going to label it. So you can see here, right, something happened to this guy, and now he labels it as I feel afraid. Right? That's a conscious experience. What is that cognitive label you put on the emotion? And then the expressive behavior, that's going to be the observable behavior. And a big part of this will be facial expression and different body movements as well. So how are you expressing that emotion? And then once again, if we went back to the 6 universal emotions, this would be an example of the expressive behavior as a facial expression of those emotions. And once again, the facial expressions are also universal. So not only are the emotions universal, but also the facial expressions. So once again, we're going to have physiological arousal, conscious experience, and then expressive behavior. So now, why do we have different theories on this? Well, most of the psychologists, so they agree on the components, but they disagree in terms of what order that those components occur in. So we're going to look at 3 different theories. We have James Lange, Cannon-Bard, and Schachter and Singer. And Schachter and Singer is going to sometimes be referred to as the 2-factor theory. So I'll post a link on Classroom that kind of has like an online textbook overview of these. So if you need a little bit more clarification You can look at that online textbook, and that'll give you a pretty good overview of it as well as some examples. But so first, we'll start with James Lange theory, and then this just gives you kind of a specific example of the stimulus being a snake, and then the emotional response to seeing that snake. So James Lange, what he is going to propose is that emotion is a result of physiological arousal. All right, so you have physiological arousal first, and as a result of that physiological arousal, you will have the corresponding emotion. So when you recognize that change in your body, which is the physiological arousal, that tells you that you are feeling this emotion. So in this situation, you see a snake, your body responds by trembling, having an increased heart rate, and as a result, you then feel the emotion of fear. Right, so that's the James Lange theory. Now, the critics here would say that not all emotions have different physiological arousals, right? Like if you are feeling excitement, you may still tremble and have increased heart rate. So that's the biggest criticism here to James Lange theory is, emotions have similar physiological arousal, yet they're different emotions. So that doesn't work out as well. So James Lange, physiological arousal, and then that causes the emotion. Kenyon Bard, all right, if we're applying this to the stimulus of the snake again, Kenyon Bard says that you are going to experience, so you see the snake, you're going to experience physiological arousal, and at the same time, you're going to feel that emotion of fear, but they're separate of one another. So it's occurring at the same time, but they're independent of one another. So if you think about the difference between James Lange and Kenyon Bard here, James Lange says arousal causes emotion. Kenyon Bard is going to say that they have no impact on each other. They happen independently. And then Schachter and Singer are the two-factor theory, right? So sometimes you'll see it either way. Schachter and Singer, two S's, is the two-factor theory. So now the difference here with two-factor theory is going to be this is the only one that has the cognitive labeling or cognitive interpretation incorporated into it. So what Schachter and Singer say is that you see the snake, you're going to have physiological arousal because of your sympathetic nervous system. At the same time, but once again, independently, you're going to interpret that situation based off of the context. All right, so we would call this cognitive appraisal. Appraisal is when you're assessing the situation. So then the combination of those two, the combination of physiological arousal and cognitive interpretation, all right, two factors is going to lead to the emotion. So once again, two-factor, you're going to have two different components here, physiological arousal and cognitive interpretation, that result in the emotion. And the cognitive interpretation is based off of the context of the situation. So an example of that would be, so if we take like the snake example. So you have the stimulus of a snake, right? Maybe you're someone who's very afraid of snakes, which I would fall in that category, right? So I'm going to see a snake and I'm going to have some trembling, increased heart rate, maybe some, muscles tense up. And I am going to interpret that situation, because I'm not a fan of snakes, as I'm afraid or I'm frightened. And as a result, I will have the emotion of fear. Now, someone else who may be a fan of snakes, maybe you have pet snakes, whatever it is, you see a snake, you may still have trembling and increased heart rate, but you interpret that situation as I'm excited, like, oh my God, there's a snake, I get to play with it. And then that would result in the emotion of excitement. So the two-factor theory is probably the one that's most well accepted currently because of that cognitive interpretation part. Now, if you're trying to think like, okay, how can I remember James Lange theory versus Canyon-Bard? Because they're similar, but they're different. So here's my tip. James Lange, all right, J comes before L in the alphabet. All right, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. J comes before L. Just like, according to the James Lange theory, arousal comes before emotion. All right, so J before L. As a result, you're going to have arousal before emotion. Canyon-Bard, right, if you say the alphabet very quickly, B and C can happen at the same time, ABC, right? Just like how Canyon-Bard theory, physiological arousal, emotion are going to occur at the same time. And then two-factor, just remember that it's two factors now, arousal plus interpretation, that result in that emotion. So once again, if you need a little bit more look into that and help understanding the differences, that online textbook link I'll post is very helpful. So this is just another example. You can look at, this one would be a wolf, or maybe just a really wolf-like dog attacking a man, and looking at how the different theories would explain that. All right, so your attendance check for today, and this is posted on Google Classroom as an assignment. Similar setup to yesterday. I have it set so you all have a copy made already. What you're going to do is think of a time in your life when you felt a very strong emotion and make it one of the 6 universals. So fear, excitement, disgust, sadness, happiness, and anger. And then in the Google Doc there, describe the situation. So what happened in the situation when you had that strong emotion, and then explain how each of the 3 theories would describe why you felt that emotion. So essentially what you're going to do is work through those flow charts. So identify, according to James Lange theory, when would physiological arousal occur? What was the physiological arousal? And then when would the emotion occur? And then Canyon-Bard, think, what's the difference now? And then two-factor, once again, go through that flow chart. And then the last part, identify which theory you think best explains your emotion and justify why. So just explain which one you feel like is most credible, which theory do you think is best, and then just give a short little explanation why. And once again, so that is on Google Classroom. All right, the Google Doc there is on Google Classroom. Describe the situation, explain using each of the 3 theories, and then identify which theory you think best explains your emotion and justify why. Get that turned in, you're good to go. Obviously, email me if you have any questions, and we can work through those together. The other, just a couple of reminders. So focus notes, make sure you're following along with those. You are going to have some to do over spring break, which should be fine. Hopefully you're social distancing, so you should be all right. And then on Monday, when we get back from spring break, we'll have our first focus note check. And you will have to be up through, let me see if I can pull it up here. I believe it was 57-3. So we'll look here, right? As long as you're up to 57-3 and you can turn those in on Monday, that's what you should be doing. So I know some of you may have started a little early, So you're off, you're ahead of schedule, which is perfectly fine. And then if you keep working on those, obviously you have less to do over break. Have a great rest of your day. See you later.